Keith, I don't know if you're going to start saying who you are.
Okay, so I'm Professor Keith Willett. My role is as Medical Director for Acute Care and Emergency Preparedness in NHS England, and I was the Chair of the MESH Working Group and the MESH Oversight Group.
And I'm Keith Ridge, I'm Chief Pharmaceutical Officer. I think it's important I point out that my role extends beyond NHS England. So it's system-wide, including for the Department of Health.
Right, thank you very much indeed. One of the things that is quite difficult in the present setup that we have, the systems that we have to work, because there are so many agencies, groups that are freestanding groups, as it were, and one of the things I'd like to tease out to begin with is really who is responsible for procuring safe and effective services across the NHS. So where does this responsibility lie? Because we've got all these arm's length groups and all the rest of it. So I don't know if I'm going to call you Professor Willett because it's a distinction between the two. So would you like to start with that?
Well, in terms of overview, so NHS England's role as an arm's length body is to assure that the services are provided within NHS, but the majority of those services are actually commissioned by clinical commissioning groups, or where they have been superseded by some more recent events, but essentially by clinical commissioning groups. And so, for instance, in terms of stress and urinary incontinence and prolapse, the routine, the local service delivery for those services in the past would be the responsibility of the clinical commissioning groups to commission. NHS England oversees those, doesn't direct them, but oversees them. NHS England does have a role in directly commissioning services where they are specialist or they are directly commissioned. So services for armed forces personnel, prisons and secure institutions, in combination with CCGs, primary care, and then there are the specialised commission services as well. And in the context of MESH, that would now be the complex gynaecology, which would be around the removal or the management of complex cases or complications of MESH.
Right, thank you very much. That's very clear indeed. But I'm just thinking, you've only got the oversight really of the CCGs who are commissioning these services. If you feel they're wanting, if you feel that they're not commissioning the right things or in the right way, what do you do about it?
So there is an oversight of them, so they are monitored. There's an assurance process that goes on with CCGs on a regular basis. NHS England will be managing those and stepping in at a regional level where they are seen to fall short. The level of failure, if you like, that would be necessary for NHS England to step in and take control would be at quite a high level, because most of that would be addressed by putting in contingencies to help the CCG and move them forward. In terms of where they will sit in assessing the services, many of the services are based around standardised national contracts, which are, if you like, templated nationally and then adopted locally by CCGs. But actually the procurement, who they procure services from, how they assure those services, those processes belong to the CCG. And then they will sit within the framework nationally and they will, if you like, be steered by the regulatory bodies and advisory bodies. So for you have the MHRA quite clearly as one of the regulatory bodies they would work within those. We have NICE as the organisation that sets clinical standards and guidance, and so they will be working with those. And in most part, if it's outside of those areas, individual patient safety issues are dealt with by the patient safety team, which is part of NHS Improvement, not part of NHS England. And they pick up incidents as they occur. They're usually outside the scope very often of the other regulators. So they would tend to pick up things that perhaps are not under the cover of the other regulators. I don't know if Keith wants to add to that.
I thought it might help if say something about primary care, because that would be helpful. So for primary care and the sort of direct commissioning responsibilities of NHS England, so for primary care contractors, and I guess we're specifically interested in community pharmacy and general practice in this instance, but there might be others, I guess, or the other two, but I suspect those are the two main ones. So for community pharmacy, then there is a community pharmacy contractual framework which is negotiated and agreed at national level, and an assurance process which is based largely on self-assessment, although there's a bit more than that. And it's associated with the community pharmacy assurance framework, and there's a process by which, in order to determine what is covered. For general practice, then there's it's delegated effectively to CCGs, and then obviously the role of CQC. It's probably also worth mentioning the role of the General Pharmaceutical Council. I know it has already appeared, I think. And Duncan, I'm sure, would have explained to you the sort of role of the General Pharmaceutical Council, not just in terms of registrants, of which there are two professions in pharmacy, but also their system regulatory role in the form of their regulatory role around pharmacy premises and owners of pharmacies. So, other than that.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd perhaps add a bit of clarity to what I said. So, the regulators like MRHA will be responsible for regulating and overseeing where a device or medicine is used appropriately, but then there are consequences, whereas the patient safety team will be where there is an inappropriate use or it's outside of the zone of the regulator, if that makes any sense.
So the patient safety team is NHS England?
NHS Improvement.
NHS Improvement, sorry.
NHS.
Right,
we work closely with them, but it is NHS Improvement.
Right, thank you very much. Can I ask you, so when you put a CCG into special measures, that can be on various grounds, I imagine. It could be financial, that they're not meeting those targets, or it could certainly be on safety, or it could be that they are not very effective in their commissioning. So what do you do about that? You described about helping them, but if they're being put into special measures, they may be a bit resistant to help. How do you actually deal with that situation?
So that's not something either of us actually are directly involved in. We're clinicians in NHS England. We're here to really represent the clinical perspective. But when going to special measures, it would be a combination. So they can go into special measures for a variety of reasons. CQC can ask to be put into special measures. So that usually would involve a significant direct input into the CCG to support them from the regional team. And depending on what the issue was, what that support would necessarily be, whether it was financial or managerial or whatever. And in many cases, you will see a change in the board occur as a result of that. You may change certain roles within the organisation. So it's sort of the last step measure that would be undertaken, but it is undertaken where there is an individual commissioning failure.
So, can I ask then, the CQC, it gets involved in assessing some of this. So where is their relationship between NHS England and it's particularly perhaps in primary care with pharmacy in that, because two of our issues, of course, are medications.
Okay, so with pharmacy, just to be clear about that, CQC's remit is quite limited because the system regulatory role lies with the General Pharmaceutical Council. So, and as I mentioned earlier, they regulate professionals and premises. In relation to primary care more broadly in terms of general practice, then yes, then it's the CQC. And indeed, in preparation for this, I've been discussing with them aspects of what they have started to find in relation to Valparate. So I think their sort of inspection process, is clearly sort of documented in a normal way. There's a memorandum of understanding between NHS England and CQC in terms of how that works. And indeed, there are memorandum of understanding between, for example, the General Pharmaceutical Council and the CQC in order for them to have information sharing and what have you. So it's that type of
So if you have medical practice that is still giving women of childbearing age sodium valproate, something like that for epilepsy, but they haven't considered the pregnancy prevention programme. How do you A, find that out, and B, what do you do about it if you find that in fact they're not doing what is expected of them?
So I don't think we do find out as NHS England.
Sorry, you don't think you do know?
I don't think we do find out individual cases like that, and I think that's something we will consider. That would be my view. I think the CQC look for, and my discussions with them have been more about what they've found in general, and I guess CQC will be appearing or have appeared. And in my, for Valparate at least, there seems to be a bit of a mixed finding in general practice around this particular issue.
How do you mean mixed?
So I think that they are finding examples of good practice and examples where perhaps systems could be better, would be the summary of it. In the detail I've seen, which is well, detail, it's quite broad. I'm happy to make some general comments in a sort of broader way if that would be helpful at some point.
So wouldn't you be really concerned that patient safety is actually at a premium here, where the general practice is still doing what we know can cause harm?
I am concerned. So when I look at the sort of, as the evidence base has sort of increased around issues associated with valproate and the sort of how the regulator has responded, the medicines regulator in particular, the system in response to that, the organisations we've mentioned, and clearly I'm representing NHS England in particular, but I guess, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do have a broader role, then I think there are some things that could improve. And we've got to the point now where we are a year in from Sally Davis's letter, and I just, where I am in my mind is that I think there's a need to just take stock about where we've got to with valproate, and to do that across the system. Happy to sort of talk to you about why I think that, more broadly, if that would be helpful.
Who should take stock?
Yes, that's a good question. So as far as ultimately the medicines regulator has chosen, on the basis of evidence, no doubt, not just at UK level but internationally, of the sort of risk benefit basis of valproate and its usage comes down at the moment to it use in pregnancy or use in women of childbearing age, to be supported by a pregnancy prevention programme. So I guess from their point of view, then they will then look in on the basis of that for organisations to react, and professionals and professional bodies and the like to react accordingly. And when I look at what has happened, then I think so. I mean, on the pharmacy world, I think the General Pharmaceutical Council has reacted appropriately in terms of their duties and their inspection role of both registrants but also premises and owners, and I know that they have put in extra responsibilities or extra sort of monitoring around inspection. Their inspectors monitoring. I look at the IT systems in terms of flagging a warning, and you can see that having sort of looked through what's happened, then it feels to me that general practice IT systems have reacted appropriately. Community pharmacy IT systems, ditto. Where I think there might be still a gap is in hospitals, actually, where there's more flexibility to what can be flagged, what is and isn't flagged in terms of prescribing and dispensing systems. when I look at the GMC, then in terms of their reaction so far, then clearly they are there to regulate professionals and have prescribing standards that's expected for people to respond to. So I just sort of, I just wonder whether there is more to do, and that's the discussion I'm having internally right now, to sort of say, I think it's time to take stock.
You've just gone through and you've sort of basically said each of the little constituent parts have acted appropriately, but we've heard reports that the system isn't working.
Yeah, so let me carry on then in my analysis, if you don't mind. So I think in terms of NHS improvement and their responsibilities, which Keith has outlined, issuing a safety alert, and one wonders, and I know the new patient safety director will be coming to talk to you in due course. One wonders whether what goes beyond issuing a safety alert. So you get to the point where you sort of think, in the function I currently occupy, should I be sort of thinking about, so we've got to this point, we're not clear, I'm not clear on just how effective all of that has been, and whether we should at this point take stock, as I've said, and that's where I've got to.
Did I understand your concern is particularly in general practice rather than in pharmaceutical practice?
So there are some, as you may know, the new GP contract has specifically within it now, but obviously yet to be implemented, a quality improvement program which includes valparate and the requirements around valparate, which is obviously a step in the right direction. We're in the process of we're going to be deploying thousands of clinical pharmacists into practices, but that will take time. For me, that's also a step in the right direction, including in terms of dealing with this. But yes, I think there is still more to do. I think for me, I need to have sort of some clear evidence, as no doubt you do, that this is being as effective as is intended.
Have you seen evidence that at least one of the patient groups in valparate has shown us, which is that the PPP is not being followed in those clinical settings that we've just been talking about, GP surgeries and pharmacies?
I've seen the survey, I guess, in pharmacies, and clearly I've reacted to that all in with the other chief pharmaceutical officers already. You would have seen our letter, I'm sure, and the GPHC. I think have reacted to the Company Chemists Association and have reacted, and it feels to me, which is why I said that they have reacted appropriately. But when you're dealing with something which, the risk benefit balance of the drug itself, in a difficult to manage condition, which has been established, the use of the drug for many years, and ingrained in medical practice, I think, then it's a sort of, you can see how you sort of get to this position where the medicines regulators reacted in an appropriate way, but you get to the point, I think, where you have to think again about the risk-benefit balance around here, because in simplistic terms, for me, valparate's been around for a while. There are alternatives, and there are ways of managing switching from one anti-epileptic to another. Hence it's time to take stock.
But that would suggest that the risk of exposing a woman of childbearing age to the outbreak is entirely avoidable.
I think, obviously, the aim is of the program, the BPP, is in part at least to ensure that there is not just sufficient information, but sufficient information for people to make the right decision. And and ultimately, the decision as to whether a drug is on the market or not, or is contraindicated or not, is not mine. It's the medicines regulator. And the decision to prescribe is not mine. It's the individual prescriber working together with their patient. But it feels to me what is such a serious matter that we should all, at this point, I think, take stock. I've said it several times.
Is it possible to put the finger on who holds the ring in relation to responding appropriately, but also suitably rapidly to safety concerns? Who holds the ring on that? Because as Professor Willett described at the beginning, there's an awful lot of organisations involved, and they sit in silos. They've got discrete responsibilities. Who holds the ring between all of the different players to ensure that patient safety concerns are responded to, whether it's outbreak or mesh or anything else about that?
So, I think if you look at the components, then we can pull that together. So, there is already within the system the responsibilities I declared at the beginning there. Then we have a national reporting and learning system across the NHS. And that is a voluntary system, but it is encouraged to be open and forward, and that is something that works pretty well across mental health and hospitals, but that works less well in the community and in primary care. There's a commitment in the long-term plan to improve the safety, because there's a recognition that is a deficiency. And that system will be replaced, I think it's in 2020, with a new computerised system which will have artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever, in order to pick up trends and elements which we wouldn't otherwise be able to do simply because you don't collect it. And if that becomes automated, then we will start to get a sensitivity around things that we didn't have before. You've obviously also got the patient safety team, which I've talked about, for the incidents, and you've got the regulators. Then on top of that, you've also got the serious incident framework, which has been established for a good time. But that really, there's not clear criteria about when you fall into that, but it's when it's recognised to be a very serious incident where a patient's life has been seriously affected at an event, or there was an episode that could well have resulted in that, or there's a patient death. And that serious incident framework is very well established. The organisation that has the serious incident is required to report it within 48 hours to the Commissioner. The Commissioner of that service is the one that is duty-bound to investigate, ensure the standards have been met, the lessons have been learned, and only they can close that incident. There's also a requirement in that serious incident framework to inform all the other parties that would be regulated in the system, whether that's the CQC, MHRA, or anybody else. So those things that sort of the sharp bit work. NHS Improvement has the overall responsibility for ensuring all those things are in place, so that's where the sort of safety oversight sits in terms of the mandate coming down from DHSC. But I think the bit that Keith is alluding to, and I would share, and having been through the MESH investigation now for 7 years, I think it's been in my, I've been involved with it. Quite clearly, when you get to those things where there's an accumulative rising tide of issues which aren't specific, which aren't there aren't sort of loci of them where you can rapidly identify that trust as being the problem, and there's obviously a bad team or a bad surgeon or something going on. It's that sort of stuff which I think is much more difficult. And if you then add to that the issues that devices and clinical consumables or whatever, which we'll talk about in a moment, I'm sure, about MESH, actually it's a different sort of rising tide of events and how it might happen. I think we do recognise that there is, we have to be better at trying to spot that and that's going to come, and I'm sure we can talk about that in a moment. But I think there is, in that part of the safety system, it does still feel like it requires on a lot of voluntary people standing up and saying there's a problem and putting that together and collecting it, and that doesn't feel the most solid way of doing it.
So can the system, as currently constituted, deliver?
I think it can, but it's got to be wound up to be really sensitive and committed to do it. And the problem is these things happen across so many fronts. There are, I'm doing EU exit, as you may know, at the moment for I won't ask why I am, but there are 72,000 medical devices and clinical consumables that were used in the NHS last year. And there are nearly 500,000 that are on the catalogue. Now, if you imagine all of those, and given the rate of technology changes, modifications and changes, new versions of those will be coming through in their thousands a year. And some of those will have a long lag period before the problem may develop. If it's a joint replacement, you've really got to go out 15 years now before you know that the joint replacement you've just turned to wasn't as good as the one you were using. And by the way, the manufacturer's changed it 3 times, like your washing machine will upgrade, your airline has been upgraded, your car's been upgraded, all these things. So it's a very different model in order to pick that up. And clearly, I think there are real opportunities with the collection of data, but we all know the issues around that and linking data. To put ourselves in a better position to understand that. But I think there has been a commitment to start to move down that process in the long-term plan, which I think is very positive. But I think these incidents, I think, have been wake-up calls for those involved in safety and for the regulators as to whether or not their tentacles in the system are as sensitive as they need to be.
Can I just ask you, thank you very much for that explanation. I do want to say we are hugely grateful for the work that you did introducing the pause, which we recommended should be done. And I know that you had to work very closely with the Department of Health in order to achieve it. And clearly it's been very warmly welcomed by the patient groups. And I want to go back to the patients and the patient groups, because we've had all this enormous amount of evidence from them, listening to them and the problems that they've had. And just looking back a bit to the 21st of November 2012, when you sent out a letter with Sir Bruce Keogh at that time. He was then the medical director for England, and you both signed that letter. And you wanted to draw the attention of medical directors to the publication of a report from the Health Economics Consortium of York University, and the concerns that you had that time about common adverse events associated with vaginal mesh. Now, that was 2012. It took to 2017, 18, was it? 18, thank you, when we introduced the pause. Why does it take so long? Because you were clearly concerned at that time. In the intervening period, a number of women have been seriously damaged. And I just, listening to what you've been saying to Dr. Brass, it is clear it is a very complicated system we have at the moment, and getting all these dots joined up is extremely difficult. But nevertheless, surely when you were really concerned about what was happening in the introduction of surgical mesh, vaginal tapes, etc., for stress urinary incontinence, why didn't you, with your colleagues, introduce a pause, at least in 2012, 2013?
I think because there wasn't evidence, and the sort of evidence that is relied upon. And in 2012, you know how I became involved in this. I just happened to be walking through the department when they needed a doctor on a call, because a regulator was talking to government officials, and I was put onto the call, and I listened to the call, and at the end of it I was concerned that I was hearing things that the evidence wasn't sort of talking about, and I just felt we need to understand it. So when we became NHS England and we appointed a national clinical director, for maternity and women's health. I asked that National Clinical Director to start some work to explore this, to see if we could get to it. Because as an academic, I do research, I understand it. The York Report, really very poor scientific literature out there, and this is not unique to MESH. This occurs across the board when new devices, unlike in medicines that have to go through a rigorous 4-phase testing process with substantial research behind it, that's not the case for medical devices and implants for some of the reasons I discussed earlier. And when you looked at the evidence that had been accumulated at the request of the Chief Medical Officer, I think it was, the MHRA, I think, requested that. The evidence was, as it often is at that stage in the evolution of a device that's used, it is short follow-ups. They're often case series. They often come from departments and units that are enthusiasts or they're designers. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. That doesn't mean it's wrong, because that's how they've all started. And in fact, my grandmother had Sir Geoffrey Charnley's third total hip replacement, which became, and was a standard for 25 years. It lasted 3 weeks, and from the age of 40 till she died, she walked with 2 sticks and a large built-up shoe. Now, if we'd stopped total hip replacement on the back of a complication, and surgery and the use of things that are always associated with complications, no medical intervention, pharmaceutical or devices is without complications. What people have to determine is secure the evidence, and that is a balance between the evidence that you can get, which is numerical around clinical trials, around follow-up, about the complications and severity of the complications, and also that sort of the population cohort evidence. But then you have what you have experienced a lot of, I know, in the review, is that individual personal catastrophe. But if we go back to that stage, there just wasn't the evidence there. Now, Scotland, in their independent review, they went down the route of looking at all that evidence. I have to say, I didn't adopt that. The role I took was to try and bring the parties together which were not close together at the beginning, and I think I made that clear in the report. And in fact, even the patients who we brought onto that group were not close together in terms of a common cause. And what I spent the working group period doing was to try and broker through the middle of that an understanding about what we did know, what we didn't know, what the size of the problem might be and the impact, and then to say, right, let's be pragmatic. Whilst we are waiting to get evidence that says yay or nay, and this is the size of the problem, then let's make sure that we are putting in place all the things we should do. What are the things we need to put in place? We needed to put in place better quality, so we needed to make sure that the surgeons that were doing it were properly trained. That was a part of their appraisal, that we knew that the women who were able to go into the surgery, they were in safe hands, as it were. We needed to make sure that where there were registries, those registries should be open so that the data be collected on every case. We also made it part of that national reporting structure. We revised that. Importantly for me, because what had happened with MESH, and again it happens with new devices and I guess with new medicines, is that if there's a series of operations that aren't very successful, and that was undoubtedly the case with stress urinary incontinence and prolapse, that had been for many years not very successfully reported, and if they were working, then they often failed in the short to medium term. Along comes a new operation which appears in those early studies to be highly effective, and it clearly was in the early studies. And what happens then is there is a shift in clinical practice. There is a shift towards what seems to be a strong new intervention that carries with it a degree of, people want to be upfront, and they're going to their continuous professional development meetings and they're learning about the new techniques and they want to take them and offer them to their patients. But because it was also a technically really rather straightforward operation compared to something like a colpoid suspension, which is a very significant undertaking and in the best of hands still wasn't the most wonderful procedure, then suddenly what you've done is you've brought into an operation which is great, more surgeons are capable of doing it technically. It becomes the operation, and therefore the second thing that happens is, which was I think a big factor for me in my understanding, reflecting back, is that the threshold to offer patients the procedures went from being, we know in the UK there's probably 2 million women at any one time that have significant incontinence, and the figures are, as I recall from the review, that about 330,000 have it at a socially disabling level. They can't leave the home. They are forever having to pad or change or whatever. And whereas the major operations being undertaken would have been focused on the groups that were really very, very severely affected by incontinence or by prolapse, because the operation was now technically more straightforward and appeared to be successful, the threshold would have come down because it was available by more surgeons in more hospitals, and it became almost a day case. Well, it became a day case procedure, and that is what happens. And that's not unique to mesh. That happens in surgical interventions, and what you then see the consequence of is where complications arise, the impact for the patients are much more, not more devastating, because they're devastating whenever you get the complication, but if you are let's say to the other extreme, if you were dying of a condition, someone offered you a procedure which was really quite high risk, but it gave you a chance of survival, you'd probably take it. If you go to something where you've got a totally disabling condition that you can't leave home, your whole social, family, personal life is destroyed, and it doesn't work. Okay, that was bad, but that's within what a patient would anticipate being potential. But if it's someone who just has a degree of incontinence which has been far less than that, and then they get a devastating complication late down the line, that is somehow just much more unacceptable, I think, from a patient safety perspective. And those sort of things have gone on. So the other part of that was to make sure in that working group, the other thing we agreed unanimously between all the parties was that we had to improve the consenting process and the information process. So that's where the patient leaflets were promoted. That's where we went down the route of informed consent with a leaflet alongside it. And we came to a conclusion, and I know you have read the working group report, which came to a whole series of recommendations that need to be made. We were working, not with, but we were communicating all the time with the Scottish group that were looking at this, because clearly they were doing the scientific review, which, valuable as it is always difficult to really hang your hat on research which is not of the highest quality.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about the research, because you've said, of course, that mesh was seen as a highly effective device, and I can understand that. But I think what the query is with the patient groups is, why wasn't there some real research done, first of all, in sort of pilot schemes or whatever the words you use in research, so that you could actually track it? Because their feeling is that they're actually part of a research project now as guinea pigs, and they really do resent that very strongly. And they felt that the proper research should have been done before it was taken on by the whole of the NHS. And we've heard of women tell us that some of the surgeons were just there to have a go. Now, what you were describing, the safety measures, and that we adopted when we had the pause, and you've put those into place, and some of my colleagues will question you perhaps on that. But it just seemed to us extraordinary that there wasn't any attempt to do some real research before it was rolled out. So,
very good reason for that. The process by which devices come onto the market is completely different to medicines, as you know. The notifiable body structure, there's the original implants that were even taken into that structure went in on a grandfather clause, in that they'd been in use for a long time, therefore by de facto they were safe, true or not. Manufacturers, depending on the type of device, have to go through a series of checks. But most of the things that they have to go through to get the CE mark are things around the material testing qualities, the biocompatibility. They aren't required in any way to do the same level of FDA type approval research that's required with a single formulation of a medicine. And you can understand why that is, because as I described, these devices, when they come onto the market, they will be modified and modified and modified. And every year or two, each device will be updated. Now, if that's the case, does it mean every time you make a new version, or you make a modification, or you change the surface characteristics, or you change the pore size in the mesh, you have to go and do a trial? And if you're going to go and do a trial, then trials are exceptionally expensive. I'm not saying money is the problem here, but a trial, I run clinical trials, so if I run a clinical trial and I run clinical trials of implants versus no implants, so you'll be pleased to hear, those trials involving sufficient patients to give you the answer that you're looking for will cost 1 to 2 to 3 million a trial. And for most of the things that I would test in a trial, the outcomes for the patients and for what we need would be gleaned within 6 to 12 months. We very rarely need to run trials longer than that. If you're talking about devices here where the complications occur down the line, and I know from talking to many of the women who have been harmed in this, that the complications have arisen later, in fact some of them well down the line. Well, how long do you run those trials for? They would be inhibitorily expensive, and we know that the decay in the numbers of patients who will continue to take part in those trials will mean it becomes futile after a while, because you just haven't got enough numbers to make it statistically significant. So it is exceptionally difficult. So the idea that you could do randomized controls in some of the medical devices is probably unrealistic, but there are other methods that you could use by which you could assess in longer term trials. But the difficulty is, how long do you wait? You'll be aware that we only have to pick up the local newspapers or the national newspapers for the headline to be saying new wonder drug blocked by NICE, or new thing on the market. We had the innovations bill that was attempted to go through the House, which was about accelerating things onto the market because patients wanted access to them before they had gone through the full trials process. So we have to sort of bear that in mind as to what is the realistic. So I think we have this dilemma with devices as to how we ensure the checks are happening in. So there have been, and the MHRA have worked, and I know have developed, and you'll need to question them as to where they have got to with alternative ways of monitoring. Now, you'll recall that in the orthopaedic world, there were problems with hip replacements. There were some that failed early, rather than lasting 15, 20 years. We would expect a hip replacement to last. They were failing inside 3, 4, 5 years. And the British Orthopaedic Association took the professional steps to set up a programme, which is an example of how it could be done, called Beyond Compliance. In other words, over and above what the CE mark and the notified bodies would do. And what they did, they got with industry and agreed with industry that a much more granular data collection would occur for the first period of time that implants were made available, and the opportunity there is you only put them into reference sites that are collecting that additional data set. So patients have the opportunity for the new stuff, but they recognise they're part of that period. And at the end of that, or during that period, for the hip replacements, which is what it was designed for, they considered that, my understanding is, that they were pretty sure by 3 years whether this was a sound device or not. So there is the opportunity to that, but all of that is obviously quite a major undertaking when you talk about the numbers of devices there are on the market and that come onto market every year. So I think there are opportunities there, but that's the space I think we are still relatively weak in, and that the regulators could look perhaps more constructively at how they manage that. At the moment they're obviously constrained by the EU regulations, and I say at the moment because we don't really
yes, well, thank you very much for that. But I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, that the full pelvic organ prolapse, that is now has to be a research project if you're going to implement it and all the rest of it. So
although now it is actually quite difficult, and the other thing is it's quite difficult then to get patients to consent to join a research programme. And it may be, and I don't know, but the meshes that we used originally, we know they were brittle, we know they shrunk, we know they had problems, and in some people they caused an issue, and clearly in many they didn't, but they did in some. As technology improves, are there going to be meshes there that actually do what is wanted but don't have the complications? That evolution is the sort of thing that would normally happen in a device when it was being used. I know it feels like the patients are the guinea pigs, but that's the evolution of everything. Car safety is the same. The evolution in car safety has occurred by learning about accidents that have occurred in vehicles. You can't say that's the right way to go, but we have to understand that this is nowhere near as straightforward as testing medicines in animal experiments and then doing dose-dependent testing and then doing, okay, so now we've worked out it doesn't harm you, and now we've worked out a dose that might work, let's see if it actually changes the outcome of the disease, which is what the medicines process would be. That's very different in devices.
And indeed, with valproate, we've got to the point where there's considerable evidence of the risks. The issue for me is, are those risks being managed appropriately? Has the sort of intervention worked? And to be frank, we haven't got the evidence yet to know whether the intervention has worked, and that's where I am. So, as Keith said, it's a sort of very different.
But isn't this
regime.
one of the problems? We keep talking about not having the evidence, and we might have had different evidence. You, in 2012, talked about setting up a registry to capture the data. We can go back even further to the NICE guidelines in 2003 that talked about setting up a registry, capturing the data for stress urinary incontinence tapes. So for 15 years, collectively, the system has been saying this is what we needed to put in place, and somehow it didn't happen.
15 years, you said?
2003, NICE guidelines talks about setting up a register to monitor the long-term outcomes. In fact, one might say if that had been done, the story of mesh might have been very, very different, let alone how many women might not have suffered as a consequence. But the problem that I have, the Groundhog Day moment here, is you're looking at this from the outside and saying this is the system that's supposed to protect and ensure that patients are safe, provides effective, safe services. NICE is saying it, if NHS England is saying it, and it doesn't happen, what do you do?
So I fully accept that. I think we certainly reached the point where the pause was the right thing to do. We had those discussions, and the process of going through setting up the registry is underway. As you're aware, the DHSC have commissioned that work through HQIP. Had we gone back and had registries, who knows? May well do. What I have to say is, though, we still don't have. And I fully appreciate that you have interviewed many women, far more than I have spoken to, although I have spoken to a good number. But what I was trying to help understand the magnitude of the problem in order to make the arguments as to what we should do next. And that's why I'm very grateful for the patient groups again to have gone directly to department. Because they did allow us to generate the request, which was accepted, and take Secretary of State direction to do that retrospective review of the data since 2009 through to 2017. And we went to those data to try and understand what the real complication rate was, because I fully accept that you've had the interviews and there are clearly many women whose lives have been devastated by this. But it would appear also, what we don't know is how many of that 100,000 women who had tapes for SUI who haven't appeared back in the system as an obvious complication. I'm not saying I've got complications, because primary care we know are being particularly poor in this area at identifying them as mesh-related complications. But if we look at the partial or full removal rates, and that was the first time we had the opportunity at an individual patient level, which was not what the Lancet papers or the other papers research could do. At an individual patient level, we're able to track a patient from their primary operation as to when they next appeared in the system, if they did appear in the system for either a removal operation or whatever, and we're also able to track on the treatment function codes when they appeared in a variety of clinics, and we built in all the clinics that we thought were mesh-related complications, including orthopedics and trauma for leg pain and all the other things. We looked at those data, and those were published by NHS Digital. That was an independent review by NHS Digital. And the best estimate of an accumulative problem that resulted in mesh removal was less than 4% for SUI, as you know from the report, and less than 1.5% for use in prolapse. And if we looked at the attendance rate at a clinic for individual patients who'd gone through that. It also showed that there was no difference. They were higher than the average age for the age and for the gender and age match groups if they had mesh or no mesh, but they'd had a procedure for SUI or for prolapse. Their attendance rates at the clinics were the same. The only group that had a higher attendance rate were those who had Colpoid suspension. And that was true right through, and right through the 9 years follow-up. And that was, there was 100,000 patients in the SUI group, and with the mesh and non-mesh in the prolapse, again, it was over 150,000. So that's not conclusive data. But we've got to put all this in the mix to understand that I entirely supported the pause, as you know, and we enacted that. Did recognise that some patients would necessarily still require surgery because for some patients there was no alternative. Patients clearly had to be fully informed about that, and that is now undertaken, and we need to do, and are still monitoring the rate of use of mesh. It's continued to decline time and time. But I hear what you say about the registry, and that was a recommendation from the working group. We came sort of fresh. I wasn't involved in this in 2003, so I can't say why.
Can I just stay on this for a bit?
Yep, please.
We obviously, our review is in different parts, and at the moment we're trying to understand what happened, not because we're trying to blame people, we're trying to understand it. We will be, of course, looking forward, and I understand that your role has now changed, so we've now met your colleague who's taken over from you, and we're in the process of working through with her and with officials how that goes forward, not just in the area of stress urinary incontinence, but also in terms of secondary commissioning of services for meta removal, and in the whole vexed area of rectopexy and so on, pelvic organ prolapse. But just looking from the 2012 to 2018, looking back with the benefit, which is wonderful, of having hindsight, would you have done anything different with hindsight now over those last 6 years? Because that may give us some indication about where priorities need to go.
Slow. It's too slow. I mean, I have to say the process was too slow.
Yeah.
I mean, I drove it. It wouldn't have happened. I'm not taking any personal credit for that, but it probably wouldn't have moved if I hadn't said there's a problem. And I think it was very difficult with the working group, but we got there. I think what I think in retrospect, what I did was the oversight group was formed, and I formed the oversight group for the very reasons that we're discussing here. Is I was concerned that things, because how many times have we seen reports or reviews come out, and I'm sure yours won't be one of them, where things don't change. That's, and I've been around long enough in the NHS to have witnessed many of those. So the reason for forming the oversight group was, in the working group report, you will see that we identified the organisations that were responsible.
I don't want to lose my train of thought on this, and yours as well. You have a reputation of making things happen in the National Health Service over very many years. So if you say it's too slow, then we have to say, well, if Professor Willett couldn't make it work, how could it be made to work? And what we've been conscious of as we've gone up and down the country is a lot of people in the various areas that we've been given the task of looking into have suffered. And lots of people have worked very hard to try and help them, but the system seems to have failed them. So if the system's failed them, and somebody with great energy sees the problem, says it's too slow, then what do we have to think about within the system to try and reduce the risk of this sort of thing happening in the future? There may be technical things to do, but are there any systematic, structural, strategic things we need to be thinking about?
I think we discussed this where we haven't even added in the central alerting system, which is another one of the safety measures. But I think actually what I tried to do in the working group at the end of it, for each of the things we said needed to change, we identified a responsible body to do that. And the oversight group was me keeping those people in the room for the next 18 months, making sure they delivered on that. And I think we did, on all bar the registry, which has taken longer for all sorts of commissioning and funding reasons. But on all the others, so NICE, who initially were not rushing forward to redo the guidance because it wasn't that old, they stepped up to the mark. MHRA also, they stepped up to the mark, and we did hold them to account. So I think for me, there is something about clarifying the architecture for how this responds, and I'm sure this is I would suggest is a key output for the review, is how do we spot these rising tides, and when we do, what's the process we put in place in order to identify the magnitude of this rising tide, the severity, or whether in fact it isn't, it's just a phase of early learning and getting used to it, and in fact it isn't a long-term problem. What's the process that goes in place for that? Who is responsible for it? That's probably got to be a joint responsibility, but there clearly has to be somebody who's leading it. The job I did doesn't exist for someone to be put in unless it's someone is sort of identified to put in. And then having got that, ensuring that because it will be a multifunctional solution, I'm sure, that there is clear lines of accountability for who is responsible for delivering each of those.
But you mentioned NICE, and we met colleagues from NICE already today. They wrote to the British Medical Journal after the leading article on MESH last October, in November, going through answering criticism that they had accepted that they had made in that article. And it's quite clear that, talking to them and in their published letter, that there were things that they would have wanted to happen but which they have no way of making happen. And they talk about mandatory guidance, but it's not clear what mandatory means in this sense, because they can't actually mandate it to absolutely happen. So we're conscious that a lot of people have been doing lots of useful things, but the fact is the operations have gone on and people have continued to be damaged, and as you say, it's too slow. So how are we going to deal with that?
So I think I think it's got to be, again, there's a variety of interventions I would suggest. I mean, I think there needs to be and I do think you need to take medicines and devices separately, because they're just completely different. Mm-hmm. And I think the approach is quite difficult to describe in devices. Obviously, I've been around this in my head many times. I think it is quite difficult to encompass it. Interestingly, the registry we must do, it's the right thing to do, but actually we can't do that for every single version of every single device that comes on to the market. I mean, the data collection load,
well, there's a difference, if you don't mind me saying so, between a data collection system and a registry, and we've already talked to the College of Surgeons and the College of Obstetricians about this.
No, I agree, but the systems that we have that we could automate, which would be ideal, yes, will not have most of the patient outcome data in, which would be critical for patients. No. And that's what we've learned for the patients when we had we ran the workshop with patients recently on the registry. They were very keen to be able to own a contribution to their entry on the registry. But if we were to set that up for every device that goes in nationally, I think there are real opportunities around IT and information collection. Though the scan for safety concept I would strongly support. I think it's quite primitive, but nonetheless it is the real, when you can, because for the whole of my career as a trauma surgeon, I have watched my theatre staff take a sticky out of the implant that I'm about to put in a patient, stick one in the theatre register on a paper sheet, and stick one in the patient's records. But the chances of those ever being referenced again, let alone with the barcode scanner, and let alone ever connected to anything else, is, I would imagine, next to zero. So there's real opportunities around that. With the things that have been brought up in the long-term plan, and what we must try and do is to automate as much of this as possible, and that will mean patient consent, I'm sure, for their information to be shared across. That was the one thing that we were able to do with the last Secretary of State, was to get that direction on the basis of the risk of patient harm, that we could link patient data on a safety issue. And I think then under the whatever the architecture is for safety surveillance and response in the NHS. We have to build a system that will do that where possible. I don't think it'll ever be perfect. I think it's a really difficult area. I do think the regulator, I think it's quite clear which regulator is responsible for which bit though. So
It is clear.
I think it is clear from the regulator perspective. They're quite clear, but I think they are MHRA, and you will have spoken to them, but I think they're quite hamstrung in many ways by the constraints on them and by the structures that have been around them. And now I know there's been a lot of changes and they are trying to move that forward. But I did get the feeling they couldn't do all they would like to have done because of the constraints. And the issue around the pre-market checks and the post-market surveillance. And the post-market surveillance is the area where I think there is the greatest opportunity. But it's what data, how do we collect it, how do we make that manageable, and how do we ensure that we pick up the outcomes, the detrimental outcomes that the patients wish to put forward.
Just on the point about data collection, I mean, I think in your written evidence you were saying, as you just said, that having separate registers for multiple different devices or other interventions is impractical and would cost a lot of money. And you talk, I think, about having, or suggest perhaps the way forward in this area would be a gynecology database. So the concern that I would have, and I think...
Nearest fan favourites. Can you ever think of a favourite?
You've caught Siri.
I should wake Siri up. But the concern I would have, and NICE were reflecting on this morning, and I think sharing the concern, was, which is that if you have a gynecology database where you're trying to pick up patient-reported outcomes and experiences, you will pick up gynecology outcomes and experiences. But as you've seen in MESH, it's not just gynecological issues that arise. Would you end up saying what we should have is a sort of old-fashioned NHS cradle-to-grave, every person database that just follows everyone all the way through, and is that even practical?
Well, I guess it's practical. It's whether it would currently, without consent, would not be possible. That patients would have to consent, and that's we've been on this before with discussions about patient data and sharing it and linking them and all the issues that have been had before. I do think you could probably if you you should be able to have a reasonably good idea about what are the likely complications that would occur with most devices, whether they're heart valves or hip replacements or whatever. That I think you may well be able to construct some sort of linked databases that would do that. But it is not an easy ask to be comprehensive.
Well, could sort of just a couple of thoughts really. So it may or may not help. So when I was chief pharmacist in Glasgow hospitals, and I can remember turning up on the first day and finding myself not just responsible for medicines but for the medical devices world as well. It was interesting, and I reasonably quickly got it to the right person. But it was interesting when you sort of compare the sort of systems there are in place for medicines, not just regulatory and monitoring of various types and what have you, but the sort of more day-to-day systems like formulary management and the various things that go with that, and embedded pharmacists in medical teams to help ensure the right things are happening, those sorts of things. So and various other things, and they're just absent in the world of medical devices. A simple sort of a formulary being a catalogue of limited choice, and the sort of controls that go in around that. And then when I sort of think about some of the things I've been thinking about around Valparate, about consultant only, specialist only, named patient only. Should we be thinking about having the regime of a controlled drug? Those sorts of things, are sort of, okay, some of those are regulatory in nature, but some of them are they've grown up in terms of practice and systems around how medicines are managed. So I think there probably are some things, if I can help Keith Little here, to sort of say that that could be transported quite easily, I think, into the world of medical devices. The only other thing I would mention is, whilst on the, with valproate, then, we need to get to a point where there is no doubt. If it's going to continue to be used, then there's no doubt that the right thing has happened in terms of explanation, etc., understanding the risks and things. And talking to various people in another piece of work, that there's this sort of phrase which people talking to me about, which is about knowledge dissemination. The sort of, how do you put in place the type of knowledge dissemination system which will actually lead to behavioural change and what have you. And there's a lot of thinking around that, and experience in very clever academics and things in terms of how that could be done. So there's a sort of the safety belt legislation type of approach and all of that. But as ultimately, I think, in terms of the influence in behaviour, then this sort of concept of knowledge dissemination is probably quite a helpful one to explore. But in devices, I think there are some things actually which could be learned from systems which have been in place in medicines for many years, albeit sometimes they don't work very well.
Can I just ask, Professor Willett, how long will it take you to establish, and I'm not sure it's your responsibility now, but how long would it take to establish a really good database?
So the work that HQIP have done is to put in, as you're aware, an interim database which will, as I understand it, the last Parliament involved with it was to draw data from the 3 professional databases that already exist as a minimum data set, to at least to ensure that we have the opportunity for every use to be logged, and also for the procedures to be logged that are not mesh related but for treating the same condition. And that, my understanding is, I don't think the final report's come out with HQIP yet, but that was that was looking at whether NHS Digital as the sort of independent host would manage that, so that in the short term the clinicians' returns and how the data was submitted would continue, but that they would be able to hold something whilst a full registry was commissioned, because that has to go through a commissioning process, tendering and approvals process, and meeting the HQIP standards. And that's usually a 2-year process. I think it can be accelerated in part by different commissioning and contracting arrangements, but in essence that's usually a 2-year process. The number of national clinical audits we have is limited. That's based on the number. So I think the money that was the cost was about 2 million, I think, for the registry to be established and run for a period of 3 years.
I'm not talking about the registry. I'm talking about just database.
So the that database is there in the process.
2 years, did you say?
No, the registry would be established in 2. And it would be a national clinical audit registry, yes. So the registry would be 2 years, but actually a database drawing from the 3 organisations is what HQIP has been asked to
that's
look.
Not comprehensive. That's probably only a third of all the cases.
Yes. But then it's how you.
But that wouldn't fulfil the requirements of the pause.
Of all cases being logged.
Yes.
So that would, once that's in place there, we can't mandate. We don't have the legal powers to mandate. We, as an organisation, can write out, and we can work through the colleges and special associations, we can work through the GMC, we can work through the CQC, everybody recognising that that is the thing to do. The strongest lever we had in the system, which is what the working group came to the conclusion of, was actually the appraisal process and revalidation, and the responsible officers, because if doctors, surgeons can't revalidate because they haven't submitted data, that's part of their process, then clearly that is a threat to
I don't want to put words into your mouth, so tell me I've got this wrong, but I had thought that you'd pointed out, or somebody pointed out, that one way of ensuring that every operation is logged on a database, not talking about a registry, is that it's a requirement to get paid.
Well, that would be something I might have said to you, Sir Cyril. I might mention that to you. That isn't government policy, and that isn't NHS England policy. So, but clearly, I have had success working with tariff payments in securing high levels.
Who's raised that possibility with us, seriously.
So, I mean, that is something that has not been used before. And
we also have the support now of the Royal College of Surgeons that for new devices, such a database should be established, which would be 100% accurate because the surgeon would do it themselves, and you've heard me say that.
Yeah. So we've had experience of that as a incentive. The best practice tariff model that we introduced to support the implementation of major trauma networks and major trauma centres, and also to improve the hip fracture pathway for elderly patients. With that, there was 20% or thereabouts of the income per patient on the tariff was penalised or rewarded, whichever way you look at it, by returning the data. That payment wouldn't be made the last 20% wouldn't be made until that data had been entered. That was very effective. Not 100%. Nothing's 100%.
So why isn't it being proposed for this?
Because the payment models have changed since then. That isn't.
There's no way of doing it.
Payment. Well, I'm not saying there's no way of doing it. I'm not the financial finance director of the NHS.
No, we might not be able to do the perfect. We might try and do the best we can. So we need a database. Everybody has agreed we need a really robust database, but it may not be 100% perfect. We understand that. How long would it take to actually get one established, bearing in mind that you can't mandate, but at least we would then...
Well, I think that what you're talking about is a comprehensive registry, which is the same as a national clinical audit, which is the 2-year time frame, which is what HCRIP are working to. What the interim was, just to make sure there was an opportunity that all cases could be logged, particularly going forward, because we don't want a period of time when we're not having patients logged who are going into the system, because that would be really important. We don't want
I thought a registry was much more complicated than just a database.
So a database is just a collection of data.
Yes, well,
you choose the points.
That's what I'm asking.
But actually, a national clinical audit is one whereby you build in the outcomes and you build in the clinical specific things, which are, some of those may be more softer, if you like, in terms of what's been done, and they're more pathway orientated than just about how old was the patient, when did they have their operation, when did they next appear. And then a registry is what you would normally attribute to just logging the implant, rather than...
We must be really careful here, Keith. Yeah. We're going to end up with not understanding each other because we don't define the terms in the same way. A database, for the purpose of where we're thinking about it, doesn't mean it's right, but the way we're thinking about it, a database is something where you create an entry into a digital database for every time you do the operation. All right? That, as I understand it, does not require, under GDPR, patients' consent to go on a database if that is mandated legally through the system. However, you do require under GDPR patient approval to establish them on a registry. The registry could interrogate the database and would do all the other things that registries you and I have been involved in our clinical careers over many years do. But at least once we've got the database established and running, it's ticking, so that as time goes by, the registry can interrogate it 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out. And the pause, as I understood it, was about, among other things, making sure that we're logging all the operations so that we can interrogate them for long-term outcomes when the time comes. Is that clear?
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
Can I just ask about the same in relation to medicines of outbreak specifically? Mm-hmm. So, at the moment, I mean, Dr. Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, at the moment, we don't have a means of tracking what happens to a woman who takes valproate while pregnant and then goes on to have a baby. There isn't a way of tracking that. Should there be, and how do we set it up?
Okay, so as I understand it, so the MHRA are looking at that as I understand it, and I think they're coming before you later in the month, I think. So it's probably best to hold that. But the concept of registry in this space is the same, it seems to me, and I know the MHRA are looking at that right now.
Do you think, from where you sit, that would be a useful addition to the system?
So, in order to, from my view on it, in order to, if we accept that there's a risk associated with this drug, and that the regulator over, indeed regulators, medicines regulators over the years have judged the risk benefit correctly, and that prescribers and indeed dispensers, I guess, but also patients themselves are understanding of those risks, and that is being monitored appropriately in the way you've described, then yes, of course you would. But it's a sort of, that's part of the jigsaw, I guess, Simon, isn't it? That, there's other parts which all of that needs to work.
Yeah. And in terms of the mechanics of it, how complicated do you think it would be to create such a database?
So, when I look at the prescribing data which I have then and see, so I think the figure which is quoted in Sally's letter is 27,000 patients, then it should be doable. I would have thought it should be doable.
I suppose the same question arises as in the case of mesh. Should it have been done before now?
My view, when you look at the risk associated with this particular medicine, given if we're talking, we are talking about 4 out of 10 women in terms of teratogenicity, and 1 out of 10 being in terms of neurological development, and 1 out of 10 in terms of abnormality, then that feels significant to me, and therefore being able to track that information, the progress associated with people on this medicine, seems important. So my view would be yes.
Can I ask a question? I don't understand, probably I ought to, because my grandfather was a pharmacist, and my mother, but when a prescription is issued on the National Health Service, it goes to a clearinghouse, doesn't it, so the pharmacist can be paid in some sort of way?
Yeah, that's called the BSA, yes.
Is it at that point possible to register that I've received this medicine as a patient on some sort of factor databases?
So community pharmacy that's what you're describing there is the reimbursement system.
Yes, but using the reimbursement system to log that valproate and me with who I am, my demographics.
Yes, is the answer to your question. So at the moment we do have data looking at the subset of people, of females within a particular age group, childbearing age, and the prescribing data, or sorry, should I call it the reimbursement data, and how that is changing over time. And at the moment, I don't know if you've seen that, but it is coming down. So the answer is yes, you can, and we've also done some work recently in another area to link patient number with individual prescribing. So this is part of the work I did with the former Secretary of State on medication error.
Using the NHS number?
Yeah. So it is possible in primary care.
That could be done quite quickly in primary care because those mechanisms exist now.
Possibly. worth exploring.
It's the will to do it.
Yes, there is a will. I'm quite determined. But I come back to what I said originally, and in many ways Keith's an example of it, isn't it? He has clearly taken the initiative, and I think it's going to require someone to take the initiative to sort of ensure that the intervention is working well or not.
Do you think it should be the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer?
Chief Pharmaceutical Officer would be willing to do it, but I think whether that's the most appropriate thing or not, I don't know. And I guess that will come in due course. We have a new Patient Safety Director as well. One would imagine that wherever it says, I have no problem with that sort of thing. It's pretty obvious that we need to be clear.
Professor Willett, can I just return to MESH?
Mm-hmm.
And again, thank you for all that you've been doing. I appreciate you've been working extremely hard in this field and that you no longer have the responsibility. And so this may be an unfair question, in which case just tell me. But can I ask you how you see the future of the pause, where we are on it, and any other comments you've got on it?
So I think the pause has been very effective. We have clearly seen as a result of, and I'm grateful for everybody that contributed to that from the clinical arena and around describing what was a patient-appropriate and clinically sound way to introduce the pause, with both the restriction and the high vigilance, because that allowed us to do something. It also allowed us to test something, I think, that may allow us to take it forward, in that the high vigilance, so even if we perhaps have, in terms of what has been achieved in terms of meeting the requirements of the pause, we have an opportunity to maintain the high vigilance process in place, which I think is quite useful. Having now established, it's been accepted. In fact, it was recommended by the profession. I think that has been very useful, and I think we can run that. And it's a bit like I said about the reference centres when a new device comes in. It's like they should go into a high vigilance process in a certain number of centres for a certain length of time, and then when people are comfortable that this looks right, you can go back to the normal sort of process. So clearly we're dependent on the NICE guidance publication. We're also dependent on HQIP, the reports coming out. So they're all going to come out at the same time, and there just needs to be a rain check at that point taken with your recommendations as to how this now sits. So for me, I think this has been a useful reflective period. There's a lot of things have gone on. We've got those things coming. We'll have your position from the review. We'll have the HQIP sort of what it takes in terms of the database registry, national clinical audit. We'll have the view from NICE. So we will have sort of I think there's a point in time where we will sit down and say, okay, so now what's the right and proper thing to do to take this forward? What is there a role for MESH? What is the role for MESH? If there is a role for MESH, how is it scrutinised or whatever? So I think that is the right thing to do. I don't think I can, until I have seen all that and that's been put down and thought about, given the context of what's gone on, I don't think I would be able to give you a view as to how it goes forward. I would imagine, though, that there will be a case for some ongoing use of MESH in a highly restricted and monitored capacity, which will be part of it. Clearly, I believe specialised commissioning from NHS England are going to give evidence to you as well. But another part of the working group was obviously to ensure that we set up the centres and commissioned the complex gynecology centres who would address the complications of MESH, because that clearly was something where the system did let patients down, because a lot of people didn't realise that the problem was MESH, didn't realise that removal was an option, and we certainly didn't get the referral patterns right there. So I think that also will have been addressed. So I think we'll be looking at a bit of a different landscape, to be quite honest, Baroness. So I think it would be sensible at that point for everyone just to sit down and reflect on what is the next step forward.
So in the meantime, it will stand as it is now.
Well, I think it stands until those are completed, and I don't think there's a problem with that. I think the system has got used to it. We asked the numbers from in fact, the figures are due out today, I believe, from NHS Digital the next month. I haven't seen them yet. But I think the numbers of the number of episodes of mesh being used has continued to sort of decline steadily over that period. So I think we're seeing now a much more highly selective group of patients, and that may be the appropriate, that appropriate group. And the number of removals has stayed about the same. So we're not seeing a sort of any rise in the numbers. So we're still, looks like we're still addressing those that are coming forward with problems from the past.
Are we making bigger inroads into what's happening in the private sector?
So it's part of the NHS. We don't have, that's a DHSC remit in terms of the independent sector, but clearly you didn't expect me to ignore them. So I did meet up with all the medical directors of the major private companies and hospitals, and in fact I would say they were very, very keen to ensure, and I'm sure for lots of reasons, reputation as much as anything else for commercial organisations, that they put in place the responsible officer role, ensuring that the surgeons were returning data, and we've seen that before. We saw that in the hip registry, the hip replacement registry. The independent sector was right onto that very quickly, and my understanding is the same has occurred this time around.
One of the things you've just said is that removal rates haven't changed substantially, but we've heard from quite a few women who say they have difficulty accessing removal services. So is the removals rate actually reflective of the number of people who want their implant removed? Do you have any?
I have no figures on that, so we wouldn't know those figures. Specialised commissioning may do, because obviously that removal now fits under the Specialised Commission Complex Gynaecology contract. They've gone through the consultation process of that's closed, and they're now identifying the centres.
But one of the other things that we would need to ensure is that surgeons are able to offer women an alternative form of surgery to mesh surgery.
Yes.
And obviously one of the things that's happened since the growth and the use of mesh is the decline in birch-corpus suspension and other alternatives, and therefore a decline in the knowledge and skills out there to do.
I'm not sure it's a decline. Mesh has been around long enough now that most practicing surgeons were not trained in any other technique.
So what do we do about that?
So that was why I brought in the high vigilance process into the alternative operations as well, because the last thing we needed was the mesh complications being diminished and then us having a whole lot of new complications of equal magnitude or worse, because people were trying to do operations that they hadn't done previously. So there is then a training, which is why I think there's a pause at the end of the pause, as it were, and everyone says, right, where do we go? Because if we're now talking about changing competencies, we're talking about new training programs. I mean, there are still surgeons around who can do those procedures, but they are technically very difficult. I mean, I am a pelvic surgeon, but not for gynecological reasons. And the tissues in an older person, and not necessarily very old, but in an older person, some people, we're all as much different on the inside as we are on the outside, and some people have really poor tissues, and with the best will in the world, trying to do an operation to reconstruct tissues is just not possible. And in fact, the corpus suspension procedure, actually you almost create a mesh with, rather than polypropylene, with another form, which is what was the corpus suspension operation, is not actually a million miles away from it, because and then what happens is the anchorage in that tissue fails. And the same thing applies to the things like retropubic sling, where you're using fascia. If the fascia's poor down in the pelvic floor, it's usually poor in the abdominal wall, and the tissues, and because they're natural tissues, they decay or are broken down, they lose their strength, and so they become incompetent, which is why you can understand why tape came in the first place, because people were struggling to give patients the sustained outcome that they wanted to give them.
One of the points that's been put to us about copper suspension, though, is that it was and could have continued to be an evolutionary technique, but the mesh got in the way of that.
Well, mesh was the evolution, really. It sort of took that sort of it almost, in copper suspension, they were sort of building like a trampoline of suture material onto the tissues that were good to hold the pelvic floor up. I'm not a gynaecologist, so if this has been videoed and watched by gynaecologists, I'll be getting numerous letters, I'm sure. But so mesh was sort of the obvious way to do it. Rather than make lots of sutures, let's put a mesh there, which essentially does it and tie the mesh in, so we've got the inherent strength and more anchor points. So that was the logic. So it was an evolution. The evidence around biological alternatives, and I mean biodegradable alternatives, the evidence for that is quite clear and nice. That only really should be experimental at the moment, because they appear not to have a sustained benefit. Because you're not trying to just do something temporarily, then it's going to be fine. You're actually trying to build a architecture that will last long term. And there are two ways you do that, either with inherently the strength within the mesh itself, or in the reaction to a foreign material, which is what you get, which creates scar tissue, which is a good form of creating an alternative layer of tissue. So that's why it came in. I can't give you an idea as to whether copper suspension would evolve in a different way if mesh hadn't come through it. I just don't know. Not my specialty.
Can I go back to the beginning when we were
Please.
talking about patients and patient groups? I mean, one of the things that's come out so strongly is that patients really do feel that they're not being listened to. And we've heard of individual cases where surgeons have been totally dismissive of the women's worries and concerns. So how do we, in the future, ensure that the patient voice is heard and that people take it seriously? And I have to say, there is also a gender issue here as well that we've come across. But I'm not going to go into that, because I could be here for 2 weeks talking to you about that, but I'm not going to. I just really want to know, how can we ensure that the patient voice is heard, respected and actioned?
And that's right. So you're balancing this cohort of patients who have a problem and a recorded numerical complication rate that some study has shown, versus that collection of individuals who've had a devastating effect. And that's a really difficult one to do. So we have to create a model, and I talked about what we put in as an alternative. That's got to be one which is biased towards the patient. We have to give the patient's voice, because the patients may not be as articulate. They can certainly be bamboozled by surgeons and by regulators and by everybody else, but also they have a betrayed trust already, and that makes them often very reluctant to step forward into those arenas. So I think it is very difficult. So you have no choice but, I think, to intentionally bias the patient voice to be heard, which means you have to create a structure in which that is prominent. And it's almost like you have to have an evidence to disprove the problem rather than prove the problem. I don't quite know how you do that, and particularly given it's such a number of things, and given the longevity of the problems, because you may have just a few things in the first few years, and then suddenly you start to get the problems with metal on metal hip replacements, batteries failing in pacemakers. There's a list out there, aren't there? So how you describe something that encompasses all of those, I do think is very difficult, and it probably needs a lot of people to do a lot of hard thinking with as many inputs as possible. And I think what we've gone through with valproate and with mesh has got us some way forward in doing some of that thinking.
But I think one of the consistent messages that we've heard from all the people that we've spoken to, and this applies to valproate affected families as well, is that they have had to fight to be listened to and to receive the kind of care and support that they need. And in some cases they fight but they don't get it. In some cases, they're lucky enough to get it, but it is almost a case of luck.
Part of that was lack of information and ignorance on the clinician side, that there was a problem that this could be. Hence the work we did on the GP communications and the sort of informed consent. So there was but I can't believe any gynaecologist or urologist out there now doesn't know that there is a potential problem. There's a whole series of complications that can be attributed to mesh.
We're told every time we speak to women affected by mesh that some of them are still today currently battling against denial from their surgeon.
I'm mortified to hear that, because I just think the amount we've done, how that is the case, I struggle to understand, because anybody who cares for their patients, none of us want our operations to go wrong, none of us want to see complications, and it does require a bit of bravery to stand up and say, it's gone wrong, I'm really sorry, but we've all been there, things do go wrong, and we try desperately hard and we have to learn from it, but to not be aware that those complications could now occur and be attributed to what's gone on, I think, or even if you are, not to then refer the patient on for a second opinion if you genuinely believe where the patient is clearly seeking that advice, I think is poor, very poor. So I think we have to bias the system in the patient's favour and then disprove that there's a problem rather than the other way around. And so I think the idea that we can do something around that, but that really sits within that post-market surveillance regulatory responsibility, I would argue, as the home, as part of the safety structure within the NHS.
To do that, the patient has to be aware of the implant that they've had, and they have to make the connection between the implant and the symptoms. So it always requires the onus being the patient.
Yeah, and that's really difficult. I don't know whether you were listening to the news, but there was the whole issue in the news last night about white goods catching fire and the recalls, and we buy the white goods, and apparently less than a third of the registrations are completed by the public. And this is white goods, so all they have to do is literally, send a card off in the post, which is a free post, or go online, and we don't do it, and then when the manufacturer has a problem and wants to recall them all, they can't get hold of them. That's how we do that, because we'd all love to say, patients should own as much of their care and responsibility as possible, but in reality, we're going to have a symptom prompt. So for me, things like the scan for safety we talked about earlier, where that barcode says on this patient, so when that NHS number appears in general practice anywhere, somebody knows that patient has got that.
It's logged centrally, not just in the University of Leicester.
Correct.
Yes.
Why did you choose Leicester? No.
Can I just ask, is there, we haven't talked about this before, a sort of BME dimension to some of what we're trying to do, what you've been trying to do, both I'm thinking about the valve and about the mesh, but just more broadly about how to reach, harder to reach groups.
There's bound to be, I would say, any harder to reach group, and it's not only BME, it's it's vulnerable individuals in society, always a real challenge. And there we are reliant very much on the system being the spotter of where the connection might need to be made, particularly with people who are often not registered. They don't have registered GPs, they rely on using A&E departments. We can do this for child protection very well in the sort of acute sector. Anywhere you appear, if you're on the register, the flag goes up. And GP systems actually have very good flagging systems, although they flag so many things.
That took 10 years. By the way, the child protection, I'm not getting that to go back. That took 10 years.
Yeah, no.
I think in
so about 7 years is not too bad.
Prescribing generally, you do see variation, like many other things across the country, but in terms of, for example, the use of particular types of medicines in more deprived areas, and you do see differences, and one wonders what the explanation is. I think, just to say on the sort of on valproate specifically, in terms of patient engagement, and you're obviously aware of the group that the MHRA and others established, met yesterday, I understand, as an ongoing discussion. But I would be, given how long valproate has been on the market, then if a consultant urologist doesn't know the issues associated with valproate, I would be very surprised. But I guess on the other side of that coin is you would you sometimes feel that the risk associated with this medicine, which is considerable, has sort of become ingrained into practice, and ingrained into practice over the best part of 30, 40 years. And my understanding, given the nature of epilepsy, for example, and what it would mean to people as individuals, practically and otherwise, to have controlled epilepsy becoming uncontrolled. And my impression is that there are some aspects of the use of valproate which clinicians find also helpful, for example, the sedatory sort of element of it and what have you. Then I think it becomes a sort of, you begin to wonder just whether it's such ingrained in practice that the regulatory decision, I'm sure, is always right, but you start to put in place a range of mechanisms. Now we're into the pregnancy prevention programme. At what point do you sort of say, well, actually we need to go to the next stage, or whatever that might be? So that's where I am.
I think one of the problems with the pregnancy prevention programme that we've certainly heard is that neurologists will tell us that they don't feel comfortable talking to women about contraception. GPs, on the other hand, the RCGP told us this, feel that is the job of the neurologist. And I don't know where the pharmacists sit in that, but...
So the pharmacist should be, as you all know, they should be discussing each time that valproate is dispensed with the patient, even if, I think the CCA work has shown something like 40-50% of patients aren't actually collecting their medication. If you see it, it's someone else collecting it for them, and all the difficulties that sort of leads to. So, but they should be discussing. So it's disappointing to hear that, and hence my sort of thing about, there's an intervention that's been designed. We need to check whether that is working or not, and if it's not working, to put in place the measures that need to make it work.
But in terms of looking at the intervention, I mean, with the pregnancy prevention programme, it reminds me of the Accutane programme in the US, the SMART programme, which consisted of a very similar system to manage Accutane-related teratogenicity. And it was, again, stickers on boxes, negative pregnancy tests. Pharmacists, everyone had to agree to 2 forms of contraception. And it frankly didn't work. Now, that was put in 2002. They then switched in 2006 to a new online system with the FDA approved. And I just kind of looked at it and said, well, if other countries have done something similar and found it didn't work, why do we not seem to be learning from that example? Why are we sort of putting in place something that looks very similar to what they had, rather than moving on to a system they've now had in place for a decade, which actually hasn't been as effective as they'd hoped either?
So you have a point. I think I think from as much for the regulator as for the NHS to respond to. And I guess I'll say it again, where I've got 2 in my mind is we need to check whether the intervention is working, given the nature of what we're dealing with.
I wonder if I could be excused. I have another meeting to get to.
Yes, right. Okay.
I'm very happy to take any other questions by written if you have any other form.
I'm just going to ask my colleagues if they've got another question.
No.
Thank you so much. Thank you both very, very much for coming, and thank you for the work that you do, which I'm sure you don't get much appreciation, but certainly we value the work that you do. So thank you.
Thank you.